Hey, good evening. Welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. Well, I thought I would read you a short story that I wrote a little while ago on arriving in Bohol. What most writers do is they take some small event, sometimes very small event, which has an element of truth in it, and then they make a story around it which would make sense to them as a way of giving an entire picture of that. Now this one is a little dark on the humour, if you're in for that, okay, or up for it, I should say. So the title: Dying Man and the $4 Coffin. Dying man would die on Friday. He told Nana it would be so when he called her in as she was passing the house on her way to the well. He had perfected a dramatic hoarse whisper that ended in a kind of a high-pitched grunt since learning he was terminally ill. "I should have died last night," he said, "but I fought so hard. I have another few days." The foreigner was curious and more than a little doubtful. How does he know? The question floated unanswered on a sea of Visayan voices. Dying Man, in an uncharacteristic show of thoughtfulness, had suggested he would only need a coffin made of thin plywood. It would make it easier to carry it down the mountain to the barangay. "Will that be marine ply?" the foreigner wanted to know. "Of course not," he was told, not unkindly. "He's not being buried at sea." There were no volunteers for the carrying job, so someone would have to be paid. Few really understood the problems facing Dying Man. He lived on the hill in a tiny house with a small porch and a thatched nipa roof. It was only 10 by 10 and hardly big enough to swing a dog around in. I say this as Dying Man had sworn he would not be caught dead in the house with a cat, and nobody was eager to get in the way of that. Right at the start he had settled for a stupid wife, already in her advancing years. At 32 years of age she could hardly have expected to marry at all, and certainly not to a man of such quality as himself. Nevertheless, they had married and moved into her family home in the big house, and for a month or so he had submitted his many talents to such menial tasks as fetching water from the well. He built a house on the wrong side of the hill where his wife miscarried their first child, a boy. They sought the counsel of a wise woman, a seer, who, with the aid of a dowser, had told them exactly where to build the next house. Following her instructions, they rebuilt the 10 by 10 one-roomed house on the other side of the hill, where his wife subsequently delivered him, of all things, a daughter. By then he had ceased to be involved in manual work that was so far beneath him. Despite the often oppressive heat of the day, he diligently applied himself to the task of advising his wife on all matters pertaining to physical labour, from his mat on the porch. Under his careful guidance, she did all the work, well enough and without complaint. This was probably due to the threat of a beating which always hung in the air with her name on it. Any extra money he made he wisely invested downtown in his circle of close friends, where he bought his continued popularity at the bar. The treats were paid for with the proceeds of the sales of bamboo. In most cases the bamboo came from a donor who was quite unaware of his generosity. As anyone knows, cutting and carting away bamboo in the dead of night without being seen is no easy task. So Dying Man felt his rewards were hard-earned and justly deserved. At the bar, his friends stood by him to the last round. and his waiting family knew better than to complain when he returned home drunk with empty pockets. Soon enough his wife had learned to recognize the sign that warned when he was primed and ready to punish for the crime of being misunderstood. If he was able to stand, he was able to be misunderstood. Dying Man first started dying properly about a month ago. From his deathbed, he had sent his embarrassed wife to the big house to beg for 300 pesos, which he needed for the treatment of tuberculosis at the medical center downtown. His wife was given 150 pesos just to help him die. The crisis over, Dying Man thought better of having treatment, left his deathbed, and for the moment started living again, having detected a chink in the sympathy armour at the big house. His new, if temporary hobby was bump-started with some vigour. At first his wife was sent with small requests, which could hardly be refused a dying man. He started by asking for a little sugar, which crept up to coffee, and on to the occasional iced water. From there, metaphorically speaking, it was a short walk to chicken soup and egg fried rice. Breaking into a virtual gallop brought side dishes of vegetables and fruit, until he arrived at halo halo, a Filipino delicacy and his favourite. "Maybe he's making a living out of dying," ventured the foreigner, in a display of Western sarcasm that was wasted on simpler thinking minds. As was his observation that Dying Man might soon need a printed menu if his demands continued to escalate. Tired of the wretched existence she had with Dying Man, his wife once packed her things and said she would take their daughter and return to live at home in the big house. Who could doubt the sincerity of his intention to keep his family together? Faced with the prospect of living alone and of doing all the work himself, he had shared with her the wisdom of staying with him. He did this by pointing out how easily he could and would kill her mother and father. It was gratifying to see how quickly she unpacked. Perhaps she was not so stupid after all. The Church of the Divine Inspiration was packed that Sunday of the week before Dying Man's big day. His infamous way of life and news of his impending demise were well known to everyone. They knew his grand show of sincerity was as thin as the plywood for his $4 coffin, and were unimpressed. The apparent change of heart and his gestures of last-minute goodwill were greeted with expressions more at home on the faces of someone sucking on prunes. Dying Man had sent an urgent "come quickly" message to Pastor Jeremiah the Fourth, who was busy behind the church tending to the needs of his pigs. Hoping for an early redemption he could take news of to his service on Sunday, the pastor had rushed to answer the call. He paused only to remove the wooden crates he used for carrying pigs from his motorcycle. He had dipped the tips of his fingers into the holy water, a nice little touch he had brought with him from his days as a Roman Catholic. He kissed his wife Angel on the cheek and sped up the mountain sitting on his Bible. Jeremiah the Fourth was wise in the ways and frailties of men. No cynic, he hoped for the best, but was well prepared for the worst. Though he was not pleased, he was not surprised at the sight of Dying Man, who was lying on the mat on his porch in a soiled t-shirt and minus his shorts. Hardly the wardrobe of a choice of someone hoping to make the journey to heaven. With an inner sigh, Pastor Jeremiah the Fourth saw his hopes of a good sermon on redemption sink without trace. "Will you go to Trinidad and bring back the quack doctor for me?" begged Dying Man. The question told the pastor all he needed to know about the real reason he had been summoned. He was already wishing he was back with his pigs. You always knew where you stood with pigs. He had no wish to go on such an errand, or to pay the fee of the quack doctor with his box of tricks, but how to refuse what might be the last request of a dying man. At times like this, the pastor was thankful for his close spiritual connection to the divine. A heartfelt, silent request brought the Lord to his rescue. The Lord, whose infinitely broad shoulders could more easily carry the weight of such a burden of guilt. Then, with a piety he hardly felt, and trying not to curl his lip, he averted his eyes away from the bloated, half-naked man, who smelled worse than the pigs. Pastor Jeremiah the Fourth was a good man, even on a bad day, but could feel the blood beginning to rise to his face. Politely but firmly he denied the request. "We place our trust in God, not in the quack doctor," he told Dying Man through gritted teeth. And after dashing through a quick prayer, he mounted his motorcycle and sped down the mountain ahead of the rain. As he stepped down from the porch, he admonished Dying Man more harshly than he should, but a lot less than he wished to. More as a pig farmer than a pastor, as the last shred of self-control took wing, Jeremiah the Fourth finally exploded and turned on his heel. "And for Christ's sakes, man, put some shorts on. Don't go to meet your maker with a bare ass." In the pulpit he faced his flock. A full house awaited his performance, but he was unable to give them the redemption he had hoped for. He hesitated at first, hardly knowing where to begin, but Pastor Jeremiah the Fourth had a great love of the spoken word, and his speaker's natural eloquence took over. Business was business, and he knew better than to let a little lie get in the way of a good sermon. The memory of the real event he had buried deep in a black hole, far away in the furthest reaches of his mind, to be replaced forever by the beautiful tapestry he wove in its place. He recreated the truth as he had hoped to find it. All references to quack doctors, trips to Trinidad, and Dying Man's bare ass were prudently omitted. The memory of the distasteful meeting on the porch of Dying Man was transformed into a golden moment graced by the presence of the Holy Spirit himself. In this newly created image of the event, pleas for mercy and forgiveness had poured from the mouth of Dying Man, who had finally seen the futility of his life, of his wasted life, and wished only to be forgiven. Bathed in white light and looking for all the world like the benign grandfather in the Waltons, the Holy Spirit had placed a loving hand on the head of the penitent Dying Man and given him complete absolution for all his sins. It was far from the truth, but with a purity of heart and thinking only of the greater good, Pastor Jeremiah the Fourth had called on the Lord to endorse his ever so slightly amended version of the day. Pausing for the briefest of moments in planning his sermon, he'd looked up, not a little fearfully to the sky, as if he half expected to be struck down at any second. He was relieved that fire and brimstone did not rain down on him from above, and the good pastor took this as a clear sign his request had received divine approval. With eyes cast down and hands raised up, the pastor felt sure that God in his infinite wisdom had got the point. The waiting congregation who came to church for their weekly serving of religious fervour from their pastor, as well as the delicious after-service snacks, were duly rewarded. They were inspired and uplifted by the little white lie the pastor had rebuilt into a magnificent golden truth. But not for a minute did they believe a minute or a single word. Prayers for the salvation of dying man were sung out loud and echoed in the rafters of the church, built by the very hands of the faithful themselves. And such glorious prayers as they were, that if answered would surely guarantee dying man not just safe passage to heaven, but a place at the very right hand of God. Dying man would go to his grave owing many of them money and needing forgiveness from many more for his shameful misdeeds, most of which were unforgivable. Filing out of the simple church, the congregation crossed the threshold into the real world, where forgiveness is a gift less than freely bestowed. How could they know at that exact moment they were all meeting in the same dark corner of their hearts? Shoulder to shoulder they passed into the light of day, blinking as the sun hit their faces. Each muttered a prayer of a different kind with regards to their own secret wish for the final destination of the soul of dying man. And so the congregation returned to their everyday lives, the good pastor Jeremiah the Fourth, with a job well done and always knowing where he stood, happily returned to his pigs. Dying man, alone on his mat on the porch, waited for Friday. Time, as always, a dispassionate force, continued to pass, completely fair and without emotion or favourites. Friday arrived at the big house, and life was opening the page of a new day. The foreigner stepped out onto the porch. A latecomer to join everyone for breakfast, he stretched and yawned, and ever the master of the obvious declared, "Well, it's Friday. Now, why in heaven's name does dying man only get a $4 coffin?" Around the table, the chorus of voices responded vehemently, in unison. Why in hell's name not? Hope you enjoyed that little story. Hope you're still with me. Thanks for being with a foreigner in the Philippines. Please like, comment, subscribe. Bye for now.